one last reminder, Pittsburgh, our city's biggest celebration of biking is coming up soon. The UPMC Health Plan Pedal Pittsburgh is on Sunday, August 25th, and thousands of cyclists of all ages and fitness levels are going to be touring our city together, all to support Bike Pittsburgh's mission of making our home safer for biking and walking. You can also party it up after the ride at the Finish Line Festival in Allegheny Commons Park. Join the ride. Register now at pedalpgh.org. Do you like the art of mystery? Are you into illusions? Then you definitely want to check out the latest show at Liberty Magic. It's called Meant to Be, and it's the brainchild of Hennick. He's a musician and entertainer who's performed all over the world, and he's got this really cool specialty. He offers personalized mysteries. The show runs through September 1st, and if you want to make sure you are up close to the action, definitely consider upgrading to the VIP experience. You get reserved seats in the front 2 rows, and there's a special meet and greet after the show. Get your tickets at trustarts.org/magic before they disappear. Today on CityCast Pittsburgh, college students are coming back to town, and that means for literally thousands of yins, it is lease signing season. We're bringing back a conversation about exactly what to look for in your potential new space and your potential new lease to be sure that it's a love that can last and not a home or apartment from hell. Plus, stick around for what to do if things with your landlord ever go south. It's Wednesday, August 14th. I'm Megan Harris, and here's what Pittsburgh's talking about. I'm with Adam Devo, the managing attorney for the housing department at Neighborhood Legal Services. Adam, if folks have never heard of YINS, what does the organization do?
Yeah, we are a nonprofit civil legal aid firm, which basically means we're kind of like public defenders, but for civil cases. So you're not guaranteed an attorney in civil cases, but the rights you may lose could be just as important, right? You can lose your children, you can lose your housing, things of that nature. So for folks under certain income guidelines, we can provide free attorneys to them.
And the housing department, your area, what are you focused on?
I manage the housing department, so I oversee a lot of great attorneys who do a lot of great work. It's mostly tenant defense and landlord-tenant cases, but it also deals with things like you might not necessarily think of as regular housing. So mobile home cases, utility shutoffs, rent-to-own contracts, things like that.
Yeah. Well, since we're here to talk about renting here in the city, I'm curious if you would say Pittsburgh is a good place to rent in.
I think there's good and there's bad, but overall, I think it's a relatively good city to live in. The housing stock is on the cheaper side of most rents for larger or moderately sized cities, but you can still get some of the high end stuff if you want to. And everything is relatively close. A lot of amenities in the different neighborhoods, and I think a lot of the neighborhoods have a lot of character. So I think it's generally a good city to rent in.
What have your experiences been like as a renter? Because I'm assuming you draw on those quite a bit in the work that you do.
Yeah, I think I am probably a bad example of how good of a city Pittsburgh is to rent in. I've had some pretty bad experiences. I rented from, I think, what people might call a slumlord when I was an undergrad at Pitt in South Oakland, roaches, the whole nine. That was not a great experience. The next landlord I rented from, I came back from Christmas vacation and my radiator had exploded, right? But I think some of that is where I was renting and, an aging housing stock and a large property management company or companies who are buying up a ton of properties, which is an issue. But I do think you run into the good side of things when you find those mom and pop landlords. And there's still a lot of those in Pittsburgh as well, where it's more of a human relationship between landlord and tenant. And that I think is a much more well-rounded experience. So I think that because Pittsburgh still has a mix of those things, there's the good and the bad. And I would say my rental experience is probably on the the bad side a little bit, but I like my landlord now, and there still is a lot of good out there.
Yeah. Well, I feel very lucky because you shared a few of your top suggestions for helping folks suss out a good spot in advance of this conversation. So I want to run through a few of them. I'll throw one out and you explain what you mean. So, number one, always check out your potential new place in person because a virtual tour and photos are just not enough. Tell us what you mean.
You really never want to rent something sight unseen. And I know it's difficult, especially like if you're moving to Pittsburgh for college or something like that. But, a lot of times there may be old pictures, things have happened since then, or they're showing you pictures of an apartment that is just like the one that you're going to be moving into, but not the one that you're going to be moving into. And sometimes if you do an in-person tour, management will try to do that same thing. But if you're buying a car, you don't want to see a car that's just like yours. You want to see a car that is the one that you're going to be purchasing, right? You want to
Yeah.
see the place that you're actually going to be living. You want to walk through it and understand the space that you're going to be living in, specifically to look and see if there's any problems with that space, and find out as much about it as you can before you make a decision that could probably impact you for the next entire year of your life.
Yeah, if not longer, right?
Yeah.
Number two, ask about costs and fees. So just reading between the lines here, I'm guessing we're talking utilities like electricity, water, gas, and the one that always got me when I was renting, parking, making sure that I don't have to pay extra for that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely you're going to have things like your rent and your late fees and things like that are going to be in your lease laid out pretty explicitly. But the things that might sneak up on you are certainly your utilities. Like I said before, Pittsburgh has an aging housing stock. Insulation might not be the best.
Hmm.
Wiring might be old. So you definitely want to see, and the person renting you the property should know, or if you can talk to previous tenants to ask, in the wintertime, what is the gas bill like if you have gas heat? In the summertime, what's the electric bill like if you have, or the electric bill like if you have air conditioning? When I moved into my current apartment, I love it. I think it's great. It's an older home. It's lovely, but the insulation is quite poor. And
Hmm.
in the summertime, my electric bill is absolutely through the roof. Like come July and August, I'm hurting.
Yeah, some former roommates and I, we used to, we had a vacation week, not because any of us were actually off work, but we would declare it when you inevitably hit that week in July or August or sometimes early September, where it's just going to be miserable for 7 days. And all of us would just go find other places to live because it was not worth it to try to cool that place.
It's cheaper for you on vacation than it is to keep the air on for a week. Yeah.
Yeah. We tried to keep ourselves flexible. Number three, Google the address and your new landlord just to see if anything terrible pops up.
Yeah. I mean, definitely check out your landlord. I think people are more likely now to kind of air things out online against their landlord if there has
I
been a
mean, that's what Reddit's
problem.
for, I think.
The Pittsburgh subreddit is always heavily involved with landlords for sure, very frequently. I am on there frequently, never posting, just kind of looking out for maybe people that I see out in the world in my job. But
Do you ever answer questions on there? Do you get into the comments?
never, no. I'm just watching from behind the scenes.
Okay.
But yeah, definitely Google your landlord, see what their reviews are like. If you have a bad one, then you will probably find out pretty quickly that you have a bad one. Check the address too, right? See, you want to see part of it as well as looking at it is like what neighborhood is this in? Not just like the property itself, but also what amenities are around. Are you gonna, maybe you love your apartment, but you might dislike the neighborhood that you live in, which is kind of a drawback.
Yeah. And I think that gets us to number four, which is, when you're touring the place, envision your life for a second, your proximity to things that matter to you, your commute, and make sure that it's actually a good fit.
Any house looks spacious when there's no furniture in it, when there's nothing in your room, right? But you have to think about what's this going to look like with my bed and my dresser and my, whatever is in there. What's this living room going to look like with a sofa in here? And then maybe that's spectacular, but is it going to be an awful commute to work? Is there no amenities? Maybe you can walk to a coffee shop or maybe you can't, or maybe, whatever it might be. Is there a park
Hmm.
near you? What do you like to do?
Can you get to the bus stop? Will your bicycle fit through the hallway? There's just a lot of
Exactly.
intangibles, I guess.
Yeah. Are you walking up 3 flights of stairs? Because if so, biking to work is going to be a huge pain every time that you have to come home.
Number five, get a lease, which is not something I expected to see on your list, Adam. I kind of thought that one went without saying.
Yeah, oral leases in Pennsylvania, so just a word of mouth contract, if both parties agree, are totally valid and legal in Pennsylvania.
I did not know that.
I will say they're becoming more and more rare just because landlords want to protect themselves, tenants want to protect themselves. And even if it's not a
Yeah.
really well thought out, thorough lease, um, folks are usually getting something in writing. But an oral lease is allowed, it is proper, it is legal. If you're renting from a large property management company, you're going to have a lease. It's
Hmm.
probably going to be online. Don't just sign it, read it, and make sure that you have a copy as well. It is a contract. It's usually for at least a year, and you want to know what rights you have and what rights may be enforced against you.
Yeah, I think important that you said it there is not just get the lease, but read it. Actually read the lease.
I read leases every day. That's my job. I hate reading my own lease when I rent a new place. I just had to do it. I'm moving at the end of the month and I had to read my new lease. And I hated doing that, but it's really important because it's one of those things where you can tell by what's in your lease how knowledgeable and how easy your landlord is going to be to work with. And maybe if they're going to try to get you on something in the back end, you can kind of be aware of that or potentially just choose to not even get involved with that person in the first place.
And that was the final tip that you suggested is number 6. If need be, if you see something that makes you twitchy, be okay with walking away and finding another spot.
Yeah, there are some things that are just huge red flags that are basically non-starters, right? If your landlord wants you to pay your rent in all cash and they're not going to give you a receipt, that's, I've seen that before. That's a huge no-go, right? There are some things in your lease that are just even common sense. You might think to yourself, there's no way this can be legal, right? A pretty common one is tenants are responsible for all repairs, which one is just not what the law says. And two, just common sense, that doesn't even really make sense, right? If your roof caves in, no one's going to have enough money to just put a whole new roof on a rental property as a tenant. And that's not your responsibility as a tenant either. But if your landlord's trying to shirk responsibility in that way, that might be someone who you don't want to deal with. And there's, you know, anything that you read in the lease that you might just common sense think this doesn't seem right to me, and if they're going to try to enforce this against me, what else does this mean? Once those red flags start to pile up, you might want to look. There is enough housing to not have to accept a place that you shouldn't have to settle for.
Well, let's talk a little more about some of those red flags, specifically the language that you look for in a lease. What else would you advise that folks maybe look out for, try to avoid, or like you said, maybe just walk away if you see something that makes you feel icky?
Yeah, I mean, the important thing is always to look at the lease terms, right? And how long you're locked into that lease. They're usually a year, and there's usually some language about, what rights the landlord has to change the terms of that lease potentially during, in the middle of that lease. If you see a lease where it gives your landlord kind of free reign to do anything while the lease term is going on, raise your rent, end it early, then you probably shouldn't feel very secure in that lease. If 5 months in, your landlord says, we're actually going to double the rent because we reassessed the market in your area, or we found a new tenant who we'd rather rent to and we're going to terminate your lease early, right? You don't feel secure in a lease. Anything where you look at this and understand that the risk and the liability is going to be solely on me is probably going to be something that you don't want to embark on that.
Yeah, two that always scared me when I was reading leases were exorbitant late fees. Not because I didn't intend to pay, but sometimes I would forget. I was really bad at that. And number two, costs for calling in a maintenance request. Those, especially the maintenance one, because that always led me to believe that stuff here needs to be repaired a lot.
Yeah, well, I'll weigh in on those. The maintenance is a huge one. In Pennsylvania, there's something called the implied warranty of habitability. It's non-waivable in a lease, and it basically just says that your landlord has to fix the property. They have to give a safe, sanitary, habitable property. And it's not on the tenant's dime, so long as they didn't cause that habitability issue. So something like that in a lease would be a red flag to me. The landlord has to maintain the property within a reasonable amount of time of the tenant telling them of an issue, and it should not be at the cost of a tenant. unless they cause that issue. So that would be a red flag for sure.
When you say cause, like what kind of cause do you mean? Because is it like because I have an enormous amount of hair and I wash it twice a day, or is it because I, backed into something and now I've, broken something sort of pivotal to the exterior of the house?
Yeah, not what someone would consider normal use, right? If you are washing your hair twice a day, that's fine. Wash your hair 3 times a day, not an issue. But it's going to be if you are, maybe you just love slamming doors and all you do is slam your door all day and then your door comes off of its hinges. Yeah, your landlord might try to hold you accountable for that if that's clearly the cause of what's happening. Or, if you walk around with cinder blocks on your feet and you have some loose floorboards, right? Like if there's something like that, that's pretty clearly caused by the tenant. But anything in the regular use, the regular wear and tear of everyday use of your property, the tenant's not going to be responsible for that.
And so if you do that and the renter, leaves the property in a state where it is just regular wear and tear, then they should get their security deposit back.
Yeah, sweep the floor, run the vacuum, scrub the countertops, whatever. But it should be in a reasonably similar state to when you moved in. And you should be getting your security deposit back that way.
Should be getting it back.
Should be.
Well, are there any other laws or, I don't know, sticky situations that you have to deal with a lot that you think tenants should know about?
Sure. That could be that. This also goes under the red flags as well. And this happens with undergraduates living in Oakland all the time. Technically, there's only supposed to be 3 unrelated individuals in a single family home at one time. That's within the city.
Oh, yeah, that's a massive Oakland problem.
It is. I mean, when I lived in Oakland, I had 5 guys living with me, and our place was certainly not suitable for that.
Did they even all have beds like that?
There was
Half
a
the
couple
time people
couches.
are crashing on couches.
It was a rotation type of situation. But sometimes your landlord will say, "Oh, well, we'll put 3 of you on the lease, and 2 of you will just be allowed to stay here." Right? That's a huge red flag as well. That goes into all the liability and who is responsible for what. And I would say another red flag there. And again, I'm a hypocrite, right? I just said that I did it. Sometimes it happens. But going back now, knowing what I know now with my job, I don't think I would.
Well, what we did at 18 and 19 and what we do later with our accumulated life knowledge is very different, right?
Certainly.
Well, if someone does make it to you at Neighborhood Legal Services, I assume that means that something may have gone wrong. What are, I guess, the main reasons that people usually make it into your office?
Yeah, for housing, a majority of the reasons that we see people come in are non-payment of rent for one reason or another. And largely, I think a lot of this falls into 2 main categories, I would say. There is habitability. There's this kind of maybe widespread misconception that if you have a habitability issue, you can just withhold all of your rent. And rent withholding is part of one of the remedies that you might have if your place is not habitable.
But don't you have to show that you're paying it? You're just not giving it? There's an escrow situation?
That's not explicitly what needs to happen. I think it is wise to set that money aside and to show that you're not using this as an excuse to not pay your rent. And also withholding 100% of your rent is almost always a terrible idea. But people come in because they're behind on rent because they've withheld due to habitability issues. We see a lot of subsidized tenants, so their rent has potentially been set incorrectly, and we have to figure that out as well. Or we see people come in with just the cases that I call life happening, right? You had a car accident, a medical issue, something like that. And we try to work with tenant and landlord there to reach kind of a peaceable resolution. But a lot of times we start because the landlord-tenant relationship, which is what it is called legally, but also just in your everyday terms, that relationship has really deteriorated, and we try to bridge the gap between the two and see if we can work something out.
Yeah, people aren't talking anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're not talking, you're never going to resolve the issue with your landlord. So we try to step in and just have that be the first step can just reestablishing communication. Can we find a way to figure this out?
Yeah. Well, let's turn this around. Any advice maybe for current or would-be landlords so that they are a good one and someone that you, Adam, would never need to meet?
One, just recognizing that you are providing, I think, what some people would call a human right, but it's a necessity of life, right? You're providing shelter to somebody, and it's not just strictly a it is a business transaction, but that's not where it starts and ends, right? You're housing human beings who have lives and are looking to you as someone to provide them something that they need. So understanding that you have, humans that you are maybe not necessarily responsible for, but you are housing, that it's not solely for you to have a passive income, and to be willing to work with them, to talk with them, to have that landlord tenant relationship. I think to learn the law at least a little bit, understand what your rights and responsibilities are as a landlord, and for a tenant for that matter, but as a landlord, understand what you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think I said it's a status of being a landlord because I think that's how a lot of people treat it, is I just own
Mm-hmm.
land, but you have to treat it as, I think, a job as well. You have to do the things when they need to be done. You have to make the repairs, maybe not the landlord themselves, but arrange for those repairs to be made. Follow the law, keep your place up to code. So understanding what responsibilities you have is also huge. It's not just, you haven't reached the end when you've purchased the property and drafted a lease.
Well, Adam, I hope that your next landlord relationship and your moving day go really well. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with CityCast Pittsburgh.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
That's all for today here on CityCast Pittsburgh. If you're listening to this and realize you may be getting the short end of the rental stick, you can find Adam and his colleagues at Neighborhood Legal Services. Their office is downtown in the Cultural District, and they've got a bunch of resources online where they answer a ton of housing questions. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Talk to you soon. The cinder blocks are giving me like moon shoes vibes. Do you remember those?
I do. It's pretty much what all of my upstairs neighbors have ever worn.